So I met her at one of our meetings and knew she disliked me intensely on sight. I was young and pretty, and she had totally succumbed to the law of gravity without attempting to do a thing about it. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest Booker Prize podcast with me, James Walton.
And me, Jo Hamya.
And today we're doing another of the Booker Books of the Month for August, obviously, and it is going to be Muriel Spark's Loitering With Intent. But let's just loiter with intent ourselves for a bit while we start off with our traditional questions to each other. Let's go for it.
Loitering With Intent starts out, we know that it starts out with Fleur Talbot, writing a memoir. They're essentially reading a book within a book.
Within a book, but we'll get onto that, yeah.
Yeah, don't confuse them yet,
okay.
James. But it did get me wondering. Well, so the first scene is sort of this remarkable scene of Fleur in a graveyard writing a poem, and a policeman comes up to her, and she's eating a sandwich, and she offers him lunch, and it's just so gorgeous. And I was wondering, if you were going to write a memoir, what life event or day of your life you would start on. Don't say birth, because that's boring.
Oh, there's my answer gone then. Okay. Yes, well, it is interesting. She picks a turning. She does say this is a big turning point in my life. She just finished one job and she's about to move on. There's that line of the Waterboys or song by the Waterboys that I'm quite fond of called That Was the River. And the chorus is, that was the river, this is the sea. And that bit when this might be on my mind now because my son is absolutely heartbreakingly at a university open day today, which means he's going to leave home. I've got to the stage now where I can't watch David Attenborough documentaries in which birds leave the nest. I mean, seriously, it's absolutely horrible. And so because that's on my mind, and I think his life now, I'm about to, he's just got a provisional license, about to just take him driving. The little fella, and he is so that point at which that was the river, this is the sea for him. So maybe it was that. Maybe it is.
That's where you'd start with your son leaving home.
No, it's made me think of that bit where you suddenly realise, or hurrah, or a bit of both. My parents are gone now, and it's me. That was the river. This is the sea.
Aww. Do you want a tissue? I've actually got one.
I actually have. I know. I'm not faking this. I don't know how I don't know how parents do the empty nest syndrome business. Just seems, a bit empty.
It's okay.
It's okay. Yeah.
My mum cried for days when I left. She lied about it.
I know.
She went, I didn't cry at all when you left, and then my sister was there saying she cried.
And obviously you prepare them for this, and this means you've done your job and everything, and it's great that he's out there in the world, but it isn't really. Well, let me come back to you with a question of almost profound, of complete shallowness after all that. You brought that out. God, you've set me off now. Okay, Jo, what's your favourite album of all time? The only way to do this is just the first two or three that pop into your head.
First two or three that pop into my head. They're all Nick Cave Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds.
It's fine, I mean.
And I think I have a really soft spot for Push the Sky Away because it's the first album. It was released in 2013, and I was a teenager at the time, and that was it wasn't my first Nick Cave album that I'd ever heard of, but the first one that I was conscious of being released, that I waited for. It had its 10-year anniversary this year, and I cried for a more pathetic reason. I listened to it all the way through.
I'm a Boatman's Call boy myself.
Are you? I find it really rough because I feel like that album has become cliched to a...
I know. The trouble is, I know, but that's like saying, what's your favourite album, Sgt. Pepper? But what if it just is the best? You know what I mean? We're about to get on to Muriel Spark, and people will say The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is by far her best book. And that's a cliche, and it's also, as far as I can see, true.
Yeah, maybe it's just the fact that Into My Arms has been so tragically overplayed at this point.
Yes, so Muriel Spark. And the reason we're doing Muriel Spark's Loitering With Intent, because this was one of three of her books that were shortlisted for the Booker Prize over the years, and the last one to be so in 1981.
Amazing shortlist.
Yeah, it was. That was the year that Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie won, and in some ways revolutionised literature, or revolutionised modern fiction.
Certainly revolutionised Booker.
It really did. Other books on the shortlist that year included Ian McEwan, The Comfort of Strangers. Rushdie and McEwan, in fact, the only two people born after the war on that list. But there's 81, which was not that long after the war. But Muriel Spark, by no means the oldest, and Molly Keane, I think, was born 1906 or something. Anyway, so that's why we've picked Loitering With Intent. I mean, apart from its obvious qualities that we'll be coming on to. It might be worth saying a bit about Muriel Spark herself. I get the impression, and I don't know if this is unfair, but sort of 30 years ago, she was absolutely one of the leading British novelists, and seemed absolutely locked in stone. I'm not sure that apart from the prime of Miss Jean Brodie, which we may come back to the fact that I think it probably is by some distance her best book, whether she's read widely anymore, but she's just, or whether she's become something of a name. I mean, we would encourage people to read her more, wouldn't we? But should we say a bit about Muriel Spark herself first?
Sure. So to your point, I always had the kind of impression that Muriel Spark was always on my to-read list. So it's great to have the excuse now, but I always sort of pictured myself reading Muriel Spark on a beach, even though I'm sort of inherently opposed to the idea of beach reads. But it's because I had this image of her as a literary hot girl. Yeah. I was so thrilled when I started looking into her that was utterly correct. And she does have this very kind of glamorous literary vagabond backstory. So she was born in Edinburgh, in quite a good neighbourhood, apparently. I have this from Alan Massey. Yeah. A very respectable neighbourhood. Yeah. When?
1918 she was born. She was first published at the age of 12. She was a poet, and she also went to James Gillespie School, where one of her teachers was Christine Kay.
And that was the inspiration for
Miss Jean Brodie, although Miss Jean Brodie twisted from Christine Kay in a way that she is one of her ways of operating, as we may discuss. I mean, she calls in her autobiography Christine Kay wonderful, inspiring, and does say she was a model for Jean Brodie, but Jean Brodie is more complicated than that.
As a young woman, she has a rather unfortunate marriage. There's this amazing interview where she says that she got married because it was the only way a young woman at the time was permitted to have sex and have fun. But it turned out that her husband was a depressive. She'd actually followed him to what was then Rhodesia and is now Zimbabwe.
That's right. As luck would have it, he was called Sidney Oswald Spark, which meant his initials were SOS. She played with a bit, and she also said at one point he was a borderline case, and I didn't like what was on either side of the border. But she also, which I think is a good point. She said she got one thing she did get out of it was a good surname. So that marriage fell apart. She came back to Britain during the war, started working for the Poetry Society, edited the Poetry Society magazine, where she feels in her autobiography she's absolutely savage about her enemies. She feels she was sort of patronised as a young woman. She was more modernist than the old-fashioned people there. And she writes about that with her autobiography, Curriculum Vitae. But the bit on the Poetry Society is fantastically bitter. Here she is on Mary Stopes, the famous champion of birth control for women, controversially at the time, and the Mary Stopes clinics and so on. And she's one of her enemies at the Poetry Society because she was involved in that. And she says, I met her at one of our meetings and knew she disliked me intensely on sight. I was young and pretty, and she had totally succumbed to the law of gravity without attempting to do a thing about it. I used to think it a pity that her mother, rather than she, had not thought of birth control. So anyway, and she also says in that book that she fed Poetry Society experiences into Loitering With Intent, but again, in the sort of same twisted way in which Christine Kay becomes Miss Jean Brodie, because it's not absolutely apparent. Picking up the story, she is sacked by the Poetry Society as the editor of the magazine. So then she sort of hung around Literary London, on the edge of Literary London, rather like the character in Loitering With Intent, wrote biographies of Mary Shelley and Emily Bronte and others, won a short story competition in the Observer, like a very prestigious one, 1951, and then she was sort of off. Her first novel, Comforters, came in 1954. Miss Jean Brodie sort of conquers the world in 1961. That brings her loads of money from films and TVs and theatre awards. And then she did become a sort of literary grande dame, living in New York and then Italy, then Rome and then Tuscany, and hosting sort of glamorous parties and living a sort of writer's life that I don't know how many people do that anymore.
She's buried in Tuscany now.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing. Her gravestone just says poeta, poet.
Oh, yes, she always considered herself a poet rather than a novelist.
Yeah, I tried to read some of her poetry. It is incredibly formal. Even though you know that she's completely in command of her craft when she's writing, there is a kind of carefree attitude in her book, or not exactly carelessness, but sort of an easiness. But her poetry it's incredibly rigorous.
I mean, I must say, it's not unusual in my experience for writers to not realise what they're best at. I think she's much better as a novelist than a poet.
Well, it's interesting. I was watching an interview with her where she was saying that the novel is a cheat for a short story and the short story is a cheat for a poem. And she considered the poem a completely superior form. And that was because she felt that the only way one could be a creative writer, and I do agree with her on this, is that you had to have an ear for musicality. You had to know how to construct a sentence so it would sound good. So with all of that, we should now summarise Loitering with Intent.
Which even by our standards is a pretty hard book to summarise.
I don't know. I feel like this one's going to be
right, okay. In that case,
unusually short.
In that case, consider the buck passed. Because, I mean, maybe should set this up. So after Miss Jean Brodie, early 60s, she's got that. She's got Girls of Slender Means, Ballad of Peckham Rye. And then tools along. She also shortlisted in the very first Booker Prize for The Public Image, which I've read and couldn't quite see what the fuss about. Driver's Seat was also appeared on. There's a Booker Prize because there's a missing year because of the way the Booker worked out. So for the missing year, 1970, The Driver's Seat appears on that, and she considered that her best book. It was a very weird one about a woman who basically shows up in a city in Italy deciding she wants to be murdered and she has to identify who's going to murder her and make him murder her. We can come back to themes of predestination. But in quite a lot of her books, there's a sort of novelist figure who creates characters, really. Miss Jean Brodie famously has her set, and she ascribes what characteristics each of them should have, and they live up to it as best they can in a way, certainly at school. So they're literary creations. So bearing all that in mind, the main character in here is a novelist who seems to be based on Muriel Spark, and then what happens?
So we open with our novelist whose name is Fleur Talbot. I love that because there's a recurring disdain for the figure of the English rose in this book, and yet its main character, who parcels out this disdain, is called Fleur. We open with an image of her in a graveyard around Earl's Court, I think.
Kensington.
Oh, Kensington.
So
somewhere
not
in
that
West
far
London.
from
I loved reading this because it was so local to me. I love it when that happens. And she's in a graveyard. She's working on a poem. She's approached by a policeman. And she basically begins to set out the premise that she will be writing a kind of memoir of a year in her life in the middle of the century. This book takes place in 1949, stretches through to 1950. And at the beginning of this year, Fleur she's working on her very first novel called War and a Chase. It's sort of a psychological thriller. She's broke in the manner of all writers. We know this. Yeah. And so a friend finds her a job at the Autobiographical Association, which I believe is based on the poetry society.
So she says in Curriculum Vitae, but it's very... When the Autobiographical Association, not the only example of this at all in Muriel Spark, is sort of semi-realistic and semi-weirder than that.
Yeah.
So it's a group of people who decide they're going to write their autobiographies, but because they don't want to scandalise people, they're going to write them and then wait 70 years before they publish them. It's run by a guy called Sir Quentin, and it consists mainly of posh people. Fleur is brought in to sort of crack their grammar and everything, but starts to make up just to sex up their stories, really. Yeah. Meanwhile,
well, we should also mention, because I think she may be my favourite character in this whole book. So Quentin is also quite beleaguered with his rather elderly, slightly spiteful and wonderful mother. Edwina, who will sort of lose control of her bladder at will whenever it suits her. And I love the phrase that's used, fluxive precipitations.
Yes, fluxive precipitations. Well, that's one of the tricks, is that Fleur suggests that phrase to Beryl Timms, who is the housekeeper, who starts using it. And so in a way she's creating dialogue for the mix of novel and, this is why I think it is quite hard to summarise, novel and reality and intertext. It really does. So even that bit you're mentioning her name, Fleur, She says, I've got one of these names that, haphazardly chosen, Fleur. Well, it's not haphazardly chosen because Muriel Spark's chosen it quite carefully.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So Fleur is sort of tarting up the autobiographical association's manuscript. She's made friends with Edwina. She's working on her War and Chase manuscript by night. She is also, and I adore this, having an affair with her friend Dottie's husband, who is a rather unaccomplished writer who later in the novel decides that not being satisfied with his wife or his mistress, he will take up with a poet amazingly named Grey Mouser.
Yes, indeed.
But very early on into the mix, and I adore Muriel Spark for this, Fleur begins to be suspicious of Sir Quentin's intent towards these members of the Autobiographical Association. Spark is wonderful because she spoils her own novels around page 5. We know that Sir Quentin is a, quote, psychological Jack the Ripper, unquote, and that he will end up dead by the end of the novel. The more interesting part, really, than the fact that Sir Quentin ends up dead and various members of the Autobiographical Association end up dead, is the fact that their group and their lives begin to mirror the manuscript that Fleur is working on, War and Chase. And there is that sort of bleed of reality into fiction, or even the question of which comes first, whether it's predestination, whether it's a sort of predestination or And so the reason you really hang around to read this book is, I suppose, not to find out what, but to find out, or not even to find out how, because that's sort of given to you in the War and Chase manuscript, but to find out, I suppose,
There are sort of thriller elements. So War and Chase starts to predict what's happening or reflect what's happening within the group. But at the same time, Sir Quentin at one point threatens to sue the publisher of War and Chase if it ever gets published.
Yes.
And so it has to be withdrawn because it says it's drawing on their lives. Meanwhile, he then steals the manuscript of War and Chase, partly to make sure it's never published and partly to insert parts of it into the autobiographies that these people have bought. So which way round, who's making up what, is very difficult to know. As it's an endlessly slippery book. There's one bit where someone asks Fleur, is it true you're writing a novel about us?
Yeah.
Now the answer to that within the book is no.
Yeah.
But the answer outside the book is well, I'm not, but Muriel Spark sort of is. And there is that question of whether Fleur is making stuff happen simply by imagining it and writing it down, or whether she is seeing that happening because she's written it down. I think we do that a bit in our own lives as well, isn't it? We sort of remember our past in a certain way, and then that becomes
narrativise.
Yeah, exactly. So which way round it is quite complicated, I think.
Well, Fleur is quite clear on which way round it is, at least at the beginning of the book. In the same way that I think Muriel Spark is, whenever people press her on her books being autobiographical, she says they're not. And people go, the characters do what you did in life. And she says, well, they sort of do. And the sort of is important.
There's that rather weird bit where she says, sometimes I only meet characters
after I've written them.
Mm. But again, that's not unique to novelists, is it? I mean, we might say, that bloke's just like David Brent or something. Once there's a character being created, then you start to see people like that character. But Sir Quentin does start to use phrases that War and Chase says in the book.
Which is just so deliciously nasty.
Yeah, but again, there's that, if you step back further, it's not coincidence that they're using phrases that were in the novel. It's because Muriel Spark wrote both of those novels. Mm. So that endless sort of twistiness. Is it too twisted? I mean, is it possible to? Because as I say, there's a pretty good story with stolen manuscripts, and she has to get it back, and then she steals the autobiographies, and then there's there's a lot of stuff that would just be in a basic thriller with a MacGuffin, the MacGuffin being the manuscript and so on. But at the same time, it's so constantly twisted that.
But I love that. I think if it was a straightforward thriller, we wouldn't really be here talking about it now. The material would exhaust itself.
No, okay. So, I mean, I sort of take your point, and I think this might be, sorry to say this in a podcast, but in a way, it's when you stop to really talk about it that it sounds a lot less fun than it is to read. Take this bit for a minute. So this is Dottie, her friend, whose husband she's sleeping with, and she's very sort of cold about that. As she says about Dottie early on, she had confronted me with my affair with her husband, which I thought tiresome of her. Anyway, so they hang on, and She says, I don't know why I thought of Dottie as my friend, but I did. I believe she thought the same about me, although she didn't really like me. In those days, among the people I mixed with, one had friends almost by predestination. There's a big Muriel Spark word we might come back to. There they were, like your winter coat and your meagre luggage. You didn't think of discarding them just because you didn't altogether like them. So the idea is you've got these friends by predestination, but the predestination, again, is because Muriel Spark has given you these friends in this novel. So
I think it probably is, that famous Muriel Spark principle of nevertheless. You're never going to settle on one distinct side of the coin. You're always going to be going nevertheless.
Do you want to say a bit about the nevertheless?
No.
Okay. Well, funny you should say that about nevertheless. Unfortunately, I did some swatting up on this idea of nevertheless in her book. It's from an essay she wrote in 1970 called "What Images Return," and she says, "My whole education in and out of school seemed even then to pivot around this word, nevertheless. My teachers used it a great deal. I find that much of my literary composition is based on the nevertheless idea." So I think this links to. Listeners might be most famous with Miss Jean Brodie, who is, on the one hand charismatic and fantastic, nevertheless a fascist. Nevertheless, an inspirational teacher. Nevertheless, a corrupting teacher.
Oh,
nevertheless,
rest in peace, Muriel Spark. You would have loved Twitter.
Yeah, that's right. Nevertheless is not a very popular concept these days.
I feel like it is a kind of how to write a Muriel Spark novel, in the sense that there's this. I'm sure it went viral on Twitter 2 or 3 years ago, but now famous, also BBC archive clip where Spark sets out how she writes a novel, and it's marvelous. And she takes out this she's sitting at her desk and she takes out a very slim kind of jotter notebook, and she opens it up and she grabs a pen and she goes,
I begin at the beginning. I write my name on the first page. I write my name, and then I write the title, then I write my name, then I turn over and I write the title of the book, I write chapter 1, and then I write on. And when it's, I leave a space so I can make alterations as I go along, but I don't revise it afterwards. And then it goes to the typist, and she types it, and I revise that, and that's the book. That's finished.
Is that how you write your books, Jo?
Absolutely, yes. She's not a serious person. But I get the sense that there are sort of little Sparkian parts of that in Loitering with Intent. Fleur at some point says, I'm quoting here, "I remember as a young child being obliged to write out in my copybook, 'Necessity is the mother of invention.' And then another maxim was, 'All is not gold that glisters, and honesty is the best policy.'" All these sort of moral sayings that she's copying into her jotter as a child to improve her handwriting, but which actually come to hand when she's writing her novel. And there is a kind of parallel between Spark using the same jotters as, when she was at school to then write her 22 books with. This idea that I think there are a lot of sort of maxims in this book on how to, what makes a good novel. You've got some kind of to hand to quote.
This is my swotty notes. Okay, I'll give you some of my swotty notes. So she's reading Warren de Chase to her friend Dottie, or friend that she doesn't like, nevertheless, her friend. And she explains things. So she, at one point, Dottie says, "This scene's very cold. There's not much emotion in it," and she's very pleased about that, because that's what she wants to write. She will say things like, "To make a character ring true, it needs to be contradictory, somewhere a paradox." And at one point, Dottie says, "But readers like to know where they stand," and Fleur doesn't agree. And you never know where you stand in a Muriel Spark book. Do you like Miss Jean Brodie? But we don't know where we stand, and then I think almost most crucially, she points out, "I am not writing so that the reader would think me a nice person,"
which is a very, I think, evolved thing to do. Actually, I think a lot of contemporary novels are sort of written with the author hoping that their reader will think that they are a good and moral person. But I guess what I really, more than the sort of sentence by sentence maxims that occur. The thing that I found really relatable about Fleur's process of writing a novel was just how much mess there was around it. Of course, this is the mess of Sir Quentin stealing her manuscript, or Dottie, stealing her manuscript for Sir Quentin, or her publisher suddenly giving up on her and her having to find a new publisher. But there are these great moments of, I guess, emotional mess where she does feel a lot of vanity and almost pride around this book. Well, she says she does it at the time. Of course, she's writing as an older woman, and she goes on to say, Warren de Chase was not going to be my best novel, of course. But she recognizes, even as a young woman, that, particularly around the stage where it comes to editing, she just wants to move on to the next book.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think maybe I've gone down a bit of a chin-stroking route with this book, and it's to the extent that it's beginning to sound like less fun to read than it is. Do you want to speak to the fun?
The fun for me is in the dialogue, and I think it's so difficult to write dialogue. Very rarely, it's difficult to read dialogue as well. As I get older, the more books I read, the less I believe in characters speaking in novels. But Muriel Spark handles dialogue beautifully, and my favourite is always, again, I love Edwina because she'll just say the most outrageous stuff. I found myself doing voices while I was reading this book. I won't do them for this podcast.
No, she's a real scene stealer, Edwina. That's true. And you're
presence.
right. You're right. Fleur does love her, and also a friend called Solly, an old guy. But both of whom helped to get her published. Both of whom she kind of, in a way, uses. There is a certain ruthlessness to her, which most people identify about Muriel Spark. That was absolutely all about the writing. There was nothing really that got between her and her art, well, and that's the way she liked it. And
yeah, I think Spark does address this kind of sideways, that sort of ruthlessness. I actually don't take it for ruthlessness so much as, I guess, just being a really great woman. There are loads of sort of whiny English rose kind of characters like Dottie in this book, but equally so Fleur and Edwina. I guess that's why I love them so much. Perhaps they're only ruthless in comparison to the much more kind of conservative, preserved, sort of very pretty, soft young women who otherwise populate this book. And the first time that Fleur meets Sir Quentin, he kind of has a bit of an argument with Miss Beryl Timms as to, how she should say her name. And it goes, the first morning, Sir Quentin introduced her to me as Beryl, Miss Timms, which she, in a top people's accent, corrected to Miss Beryl Timms. And while I stood waiting with my coat on, they had an altercation over this, he maintaining politely that before her divorce, she had been Miss Thomas Timms, and now she was, to be precise, Beryl Miss Timms, but in no circumstances was Miss Beryl Timms accepted usage. Miss Timms then announced that she could produce her national insurance card, her ration book, and her identity card to prove her name was Miss Beryl Timms. Sir Quentin held that the clerks employed in the ministries which issued these documents were ill-informed. Later, he said he would show her what he meant under correct forms of address in one of his reference books. After that, he turned to me. I hope you're not argumentative, he said. An argumentative woman is like water coming through the roof. It says so in the Holy Scriptures, either Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, I forget which. I hope you don't talk too much. And this idea that, it is really rare, to have a woman who will correct a man like Sir Quentin about what her name is, what she wants her name to be. This idea that Sir Quentin is the kind of guy who turns to a young woman like Fleur Talbot and says, oh God, I hope you're not going to natter away at me. They're perhaps only ruthless in the face of that.
No, and I think that might be, I was saying it's quite hard to, she says straight up in Curriculum Vitae, I fed my experiences of the Poetry Society into Loitering With Intent. But she says it in, I transferred a number of my experiences in the Poetry Society, as I usually do, into a fictional background in my novel Loitering With Intent, but really transforms. But I think I'm sure that's the sort of thing that the patronising so-and-sos at the Poetry Society would say to her, just... Joe, can I just introduce a mildly controversial note? I was reading...
Always.
Okay, here's John Updike talking about Muriel Spark, talks about particularly her later novels as having unmistakable power, rather carelessly applied.
Right.
Now, and I think in Loitering With Intent, for example, he says, we don't ever find out. Sir Quentin's up to no good. He's as you say, a sort of Jack the Ripper, psychological Jack the Ripper, was it?
Psychological Jack the Ripper.
But quite what he's up to, there's some hint that he's going to use the autobiographies to blackmail them, but then he's We don't really know what he's up to. We don't really care whether he gets away with it or not.
We just know that he's feeding them amphetamines.
Yeah, he's feeding them amphetamines to lose them weight. He seems to be setting up some... But we don't quite know what's going on, and we don't really mind. Is it a bit... I mean, okay, I would suggest that The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie is by far her best book. And I think, but it's, you could think of that Joseph Heller quote when people used to say to him, you haven't written a book as good as Catch-22 since. And he would say, who has? Well, I know, and I think Muriel Spark would be within her rights to say the same thing about Miss Jean Brodie.
Right.
But there is a sort of finishedness that everything sort of, whereas in quite a lot of her books, there's this sense of, as Updike says, rather carelessly applied. The closing, and I think she slightly makes a justification of that. There's one bit where she says, I don't like to load, it's bad manners to load too much emotional involvement onto your readers. Just be quite funny and get out of there. But is that fair? And the very last image, this is not a giveaway at all. Fleur is in France, isn't she? She says, some small boys were playing football and the ball came flying straight towards me. I kicked it with a chance grace, which if I had studied the affair and tried hard, I never could have done. So she's sort of saying, actually, if you try too hard, it doesn't have the same gracefulness. And that might be true, but it does mean that it's careless, I think. Away into the air is the football. Away into the air it went and landed in the small boy's waiting hands. The boy grinned. And so, having entered the fullness of my years, from there, by the grace of God, I go on my way rejoicing.
That's gorgeous. I think it depends what you want out of your novels, right? Whether you want a sense of closure or sort of, everything sort of neatly plotted out and explained, or at least, halfway done so.
No, that's what I mean. I'm being like, Dottie saying to, Fleur, what am I supposed to think?
Yeah.
Readers like to know where they stand.
Well, I'll tell you where I stand, because I really did love the experience of reading this book, and it's because that final line of Fleur going on her way rejoicing, I think, is the and by the grace of God as well, is the kind of animus of the novel. It's joyful. It's a really effervescent book, and it's really rare to. I mean, it's got some fairly dark subject matter in it. Sir Quentin is, as we said, drugging these people until they go insane. There are a few suicides, a car crash. The conditions in which Fleur lives, if you think about them properly, at the beginning she's negotiating her salary with Sir Quentin, and he offers her a rate that works for 1936, but of course it's 1949 in the novel. Her circumstances are grim, but everything is handled so lightly and so joyfully, and it's so rare now that I read a book that not only makes me laugh, but I guess makes me take stock of the everyday in a warm and in a way that makes me, quite frankly, want to go to a party. This book made me feel so happy to be 26. That's the only way I can describe it. I just looked around and I was like, oh my God, life is like this. I lived in a studio flat in North London that was similarly, cramped and packed and shabby in the way that Fleur lives in her bedsit now. But, when she has guests over and she throws dinner parties in it, they all look around admiringly and they say, God, you've really made something for yourself here, even though you have meagre circumstances. That sort of sense, yes, no, there is a sense of joy of a woman hitting her stride, isn't there? Yeah.
Of a young woman just hitting her stride and she's off. And she goes on her way rejoicing. Yes, no, that is terrific.
James, who would you recommend this novel to?
Again, most sort of mildly bookish people, people who don't. But I would advise them to do less what I did, which just breeze your way through it, enjoy the laughs, and enjoy the little coincidences, and don't try and necessarily work it all out. A, because it slightly spoils the fun, and B, because you won't be able to anyway. Well,
I think it's an incredibly slim book. That's a great thing about Muriel Spark. It bears rereading. You can always get back to it in an afternoon.
Yeah.
And just go through it again.
And yes, there's so many great scenes. And that picture of post-war London, as I say, is very sharp.
It's striking. All the black market goods.
Yeah, and the bed sits and the gas rings and they're eking out food. I imagine that on the whole, most people listening to this are pretty bookish or mildly bookish, or at least interested in books, in which case I would recommend Loitering With Intent. We should also say a little bit about, because it's a book of the month, I'm afraid that gives our listeners certain...
Don't call it homework.
Yeah, the duties would be overstating it. Opportunities, chances. I don't want to say what those duties...
Experience and exposure.
I don't want to say what those duty opportunities are.
So on our website, you will find extracts, discussion points, and reading guides.
Yeah, so to send the entire country into a frenzy of discussing Loitering With Intent by Muriel Spark over the next month. And we do look forward to hearing what you thought of it. And
come back to us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. To find out more about Loitering With Intent, the Booker Prize Book of the Month, visit our website, thebookofprizes.com, where you can find essays, reading guides, and extracts. You can let us know what you think by leaving a comment on our Substack, and find us on all social media platforms at the Booker Prizes. So with that, I'm Jo Hamia.
And I'm James Walton.
And it's been very nice talking to you. Bye.
Bye.